Hi, and welcome to our next video on semantics and pragmatics. This week, we're going to have a look at how to do things with words. So far in this course, we have covered some chapters from the history of semantic thinking, and we've also last week just closed the block on basic concepts in semantics. What we are going to do in our next thematic block is going to be pragmatics. And in this video, we're going to focus on speech acts. So when I mentioned in the beginning that we are going to have a look at how to do things with words, what I was doing was referring to this famous book by the philosopher and linguist John Austin called How to Do Things with Words. The book is based on a lecture series that he gave in the 50s at Oxford and Harvard. In those lectures and in his book, Austin argues against semantics based only on truth values, because as he argues, there is only very little meaning is actually describable in terms of truth and non-truth. He says that many sentences can not only say something which would be equivalent with having a truth value, but many sentences, and perhaps the majority of sentences, are actually meant to perform an action, not to describe the state of affairs. Right? So, for example, if someone shows me a very cute picture of a small horse, I might go, "Oh." And this sentence, this utterance, "Oh," has obviously no truth value. It can be said whether that is true or false. But what I do by saying something like that is I am performing an action, right? I'm letting my interlocutor know that I as well find the picture very cute. And so this is something that Austin, in his theory, then wants to describe. He also says then that instead of thinking about sentences as having truth values, for reasons to study pragmatics, to study speech acts, it's better to think about sentences being felicitous or not, sort of being uttered in the right conditions. Right? So we'll see in a minute what he means by that. So here we can say that by speaking, and this is important, under the right, meaning felicitous conditions, we can perform an act, a speech act. And this speech act can be divided into three sections. Whenever we say something in order to perform an action, we have an intention. This is what we call the illocution or the illocutionary act, right? So so this is what we intend to achieve. Then there is the locution or the locutionary act, which is the whatever we say, right? So the words that we utter, the sentences, and so forth. And then there is something that we call perlocution, which is the effect that our words have on our interlocutor. In an ideal scenario, the illocution and perlocution will be the same, right? So that way, we either convey the same message that we intended to convey, or our interlocutor, the hearer, does the action that we wanted them to do. But this does not necessarily have to be the case. Okay. And now if we then focus on locution, on the words that we use to perform a speech act, if we follow John Austin's principles, we'll find out that this again can be subdivided into smaller parts. So we have something that we call a phonetic act, series of sounds. Then we have a phatic act, which describes a series of sounds that is not random, but that conforms to the lexical and grammatical rules of the language we are speaking. And then we have the third layer, which Austin calls the rhetic act, meaning the series of sounds that conforms to the lexical and grammatical rules of the language we're using should also have more or less concrete reference, for instance. Right, so we can see these three layers here. So the series of sounds would be something like k, u, d, right? Cold would be then the series of sounds conforming to the lexical rules of English. And then if we say something like it's really cold out there, we can also imagine what the more or less concrete references mean, right? Here, or really, really cold, and so forth. So we know what we mean by that, and our listener, the hearer, also. And if we utter words or expressions that are at the same time a rhetic, a phatic, and a phonetic act, then we have a locutionary act. We can achieve something by saying words. So what it means is we have to speak the right words. But it's not enough to speak the right words. We also utter our words in order to perform a locutionary act under the right conditions, something that Austin describes as Felicity conditions. So let's imagine this scenario. We want to name a ship. We want to name a Navy ship, right? So in order to be able to do that, you probably have to be a monarch, the head of a country with a navy. Then you probably also have to be standing next to the ship, and ideally also holding a bottle of champagne, for instance. And then you have to say out loud something along the lines, I hereby name the ship HMS Martin, right? Something like that has to be said in order to name a ship HMS Martin. If those conditions are not fulfilled, then what we do, even if we say the right words, we're not naming a ship, we're just saying something, right? So the same would apply to other situations. This is just an illustration, but right. So if I say I hereby declare war on X, nothing's going to happen. Nobody is going to start shooting at another country because I have not the power to do that. I'm not in that position. That would have to be someone else. Right, so we can think of Felicity conditions as basically the equivalent of grammaticality in pragmatics. Right, so when we think about grammar, there are certain rules that were described a couple of moments ago when we talked about the phatic and rhetic acts. Those would be grammaticality conditions. And in pragmatics, we can talk about Felicity conditions. Right. So based on all that, and based on the theory introduced by John Austin, there is something called speech act theory. that describes how we use language to do things. And I already introduced the three aspects of speech acts, the locution, illocution, perlocution. And when we talk about speech acts, what we most likely mean is illocution, right? So that's the major interest of speech act theory. We're looking at what was intended, not as much at the form and not as much at the effect. But all of that is definitely interesting, but in the center, sort of, for speech act theory, illocution stands. And now by looking at different speech acts that people utter, we can distinguish different types of speech acts. So, first of all, there are assertives. Those are basically reporting statements. We say what the state of affair is. Columbus discovered America, right? Then there are directives that are intended to get someone to do something, right? So if we're unhappy about someone shouting, we say something like, stop shouting. Then there are commissives, speech acts that the speaker uses to commit themselves to doing something. They are very often introduced by special verbs, such as promise, swear, or the future verb forms, such as I will. Then we have declarations. In contrast to assertives, we're not reporting what the state of affairs is, we are bringing about a change in state of affairs, right? So if we say something like, I name this ship HMS Martin, then before we have done that, the ship had no name, and afterwards it has a name. It has a name, in that case, Martin. And then we also have expressives, speech acts that are used to express how we feel about a certain state of affairs, right? So if I say I'm sorry for being late, I'm not only describing that I am late, but I'm also saying that I'm unhappy about the fact. Okay, and now here just representatives is a term that is sometimes used as an equivalent for assertives. We can then make another distinction, and that is between direct and indirect speech acts. Direct speech acts are speech acts that are expressed by a certain sentence type, right? So very often, for example, we have imperatives that are used as a form of a directive, right? So if we sort of tell someone, sing or stop shouting, we are using an imperative sentence type, and it is a directive. We want someone to do something or stop doing something. But then we also have indirect speech acts, right? In this case, we have Asha saying something like, you don't switch off your bleeper ever, all right? And then Paul says something like, okay, sorry. And what we see here is a declarative sentence, you don't switch off your bleeper, that would normally be used as a assertive, describing the situation. But this is not the case in this particular case. The declarative sentence is used for an imperative, right? So we are commanding someone to do something or not to do something. So we've seen that we can distinguish between direct and indirect speech acts. And we can also distinguish between different degrees of directness or indirectness, right? So if we're unhappy about the presence of someone, we can use anything from 1, 2, 3, 4, and of course, many other options. But what is important here is that the relevant information is very often implicit. It's hidden, it's not explicit. And the more indirect we are, the more open for ambiguity or interpretation our sentences, our utterances are. And this does not necessarily have to be a bad thing, because what hearers do is draw inferences from whatever is said in order to interpret what that means. And this is something that's called conversational implicatures, something that we do not say, but that we intend, and our hearers know that. Right? And this is where the so-called cooperative principle and the maxims of conversation come into play. So the cooperative principle and maxims of conversation were introduced in the 70s by the philosopher and linguist H.B. Grice, who described that when people communicate, what they want is to cooperate. Right? So communication and social interaction works because people want to cooperate, right? You don't break the rules without a good reason. And he described a set of maxims, which I'm going to show you in a second, which can either be observed or violated, more or less. Right. And he then said that there are these four basic maxims of conversation. So the first one would be the maxim of quantity. The contribution we make should be as informative as is required. We should not say more and we should not say less. Then there is the maxim of quality, meaning we should not lie. We should not make unsupported claims. We also have the maxim of relevance, which says that we should be relevant, whatever we say should be relevant to the topic of conversation we're having. Some people even say that this is the most important maxim of them all, and there is also the relevance theory centered around this maxim. And then lastly, we also have the maxim of manner, which says that we should be brief, orderly, and polite when we speak with someone. Now, this all can be explained or illustrated by this non-linguistic example. Imagine a situation when two construction workers talk to each other, and construction worker A asks construction worker B to hand them a hammer, right? And then construction worker B does not hand over two hammers, right? That would be ridiculous, or three hammers, or five. This would be violating the maxim of quantity, right? Do not talk more than is required, do not talk less than is required. The second construction worker also does not hand over a saw or another instrument, right? So that's similar to not lying in a conversation. You're not supposed to say something else than is the case. Then we should also be relevant, right? So the construction worker, when asked for a hammer, should not hand over a carrot, because carrot is obviously not relevant to whatever construction worker A is doing. He wants a hammer, right? And the same thing would go for maxim of relevance in a conversation. When I ask someone what the time is, a relevant answer would be, it's 5 o'clock, or something like that. But if I ask someone, what the time is, and the answer I get will be a poem about unicorns, then that was not a relevant contribution to the conversation. And then lastly, if A asks B for a hammer, B does not describe the location of the hammer by means of a riddle, for example, right? So we should be brief, orderly, and polite. Okay, and now what happens if we combine the maxims that we've talked about and what we've learned about directness or indirectness of speech acts? If we do that, we'll see that maxims actually contradict each other, and we cannot observe them all in all situations. Right? So, we have the situation where someone says something like, "Can you pass me the salt?" And now the literal meaning would be, I ask you whether you are able to hand me the salt shaker, right? This would be a very unusual request, or a question. What is intended? What is the speech act actually aiming at is, I'm not asking whether you are capable, I'm asking you to hand me the salt shaker. Right, so here if we were to observe the maxim of quantity, right, to not say more, but not less than is required, we would say probably something like yes, because that's the least we can say in order to observe this maxim. But we know that this is not what is expected, right? Because that would not be relevant. So by saying yes, we would observe the maxim of quantity, but we would not observe the maxim of relevance, right? So in this case, the maxim of relevance is more important, and we know that we can. It's not as bad to say more and say something like "here you are" or "here it is." Okay, so what this tells us is that speakers often have to, or are forced to flout at least one maxim of conversation to be successful, right? And all this is based on the assumption of cooperation. We want to be helpful. And this knowing when and which maxims of conversation to flout is something that is a social and a cultural convention, just like the linguistic knowledge itself, right? So the things that we discussed a couple of weeks ago when we talked about intersubjective knowledge and intersubjective basis of language, this does not only have to do with words, to know what words to use to describe something, but this also applies to our knowledge of how to use words and what our speakers expect us to do and so forth. And this would be something called pragmatic competence. Right, so summing up, what we've learned in this video is that truth values are not nearly the whole story. We've also learned that words not only describe the state of affairs, but they can also perform acts, speech acts, if the conditions are right. Keyword, Felicity. We've also learned that speech acts can be either direct or indirect. And when we speak, we've also learned that there is a number of so-called maxims that we either follow or not. And what we've also learned is that the distinction between indirect and direct speech acts can be used to express either politeness or impoliteness. Right? And to wrap up with a insider pragmatics joke. I want to thank you all for listening. Have a nice day and see you in our live session. Bye.